Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Brandon Sharpie. I'm the Executive Director of the International Association for Conflict Management. And today we have a wonderful panel with us, hosted by Michael Gross. I will be handing it over to him in just a moment. But I do want to touch base on two items from the IACM side of things. First and foremost, we have our annual conference coming up from July 13th through 16th in Burlington, Vermont. We would love for you to join us. If you want more information for that, look in the chat box here in Zoom, and you'll find a link to our annual conference information page. And we also just yesterday unveiled our newest call for papers for a next special issue for NCMR. As a reminder, NCMR is an open access diamond publication, so feel free to jump into there if you haven't been in a while. All papers are open access. There's is open access in terms of submissions as well. So please do give it a look. Some excellent papers have been published in the last few issues. They're getting a lot of publicity. So beyond that, I want to thank the Conflict Management Division for working with and collaborating with IACM on these virtual seminars. We look forward to all the future seminars that we have coming up. We're going to have several more in the months to come, alongside these seminars like these panels that Michael's putting forth here. Our monthly VSS will be underway again shortly. So with that, this is about a 90-minute session. It's going to be a wonderful time. I'm looking forward to the discussion that comes about it, and I'm going to hand it off to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm so delighted, all of us, we're very delighted to have you here. Today's webinar is called From Micro to Macro, How Initial Ideas Lead to Societal Implications. And as Brandon mentioned, it's sponsored by the Academy of Management's Conflict Management Division and the International Association for Conflict Management. This is the third Scholar in Residence webinar this year. The first was in February, hosted by Deborah Tsai, addressing gun violence in Philadelphia. And the second was in March, hosted by Joel Gershenfeld on negotiating stakeholder alignment for large-scale systems change. So as Brandon mentioned, I'm Michael Gross. I'm a professor of management in the College of Business at Colorado State University, and I'm also a scholar in residence with the Academy of Management's Conflict Management Division. Today, joining me are three distinguished guests and colleagues. Collectively, they've had more than a half a dozen books, millions of dollars in research grants, more than 150 publications among them, maybe even close to 200, and accolades too long to list. We're very fortunate to have such accomplished scholars as panelists today, and that they can take the time to be here with us. And I want to thank all of you attending for taking your time to be with us as well. Our intention is to share our guest's journey from a micro research study to a policy or a societal change that demonstrates how sort of a quiet idea starts off with a study, and how it then created a loud voice for change in a broader context. Our guests include Dr. Tricia Jones, professor in the Department of Communication and Social Influence, and director of the Center for Conflict Management and Media Impact in the Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple University. And Dr. Randall Peterson, professor and academic director of the Leadership Institute and former chair of the Research Ethics Committee at the London Business School. And Dr. Ellen Giebel, professor of psychology, risk and safety at the University of Twente, who began her research career on the field of hostage negotiation, which led to collaboration with crisis negotiation teams worldwide. Each of our three conversations will last about 15 minutes, and after all three, we'll open the discussion up for questions and conversation. So please feel free to enter your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will do our best to address your questions. Without further ado, let's get started. Tricia, we'll start with you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Brandon. And thank you to the Conflict Management Division and IACM. Really looking forward to being able to go back and talk about the trajectory of micro to macro. In my case, talking about how my initial work as a communication scholar and microanalyses of mediation and negotiation processes ultimately led to my dedication to developing an ADR system and intervention called conflict coaching, which many of you have heard of and probably know a great deal about. And talking about kind of the why of that, talking about the how, and also talking about different systems applications for that. So I'm going to pull up a very short PowerPoint, I promise, extremely brief, right? Just to kind of guide things that might be going on, and share our screens together. All right, so let me try to make sure I can get this thing up in slideshow. All right, so hopefully that's up on your screen now, right? So where it began, I feel like I should hum that, but where it began was really in the 1980s. When I was a communication graduate student working with Linda Putnam and being influenced, by Bill Donahue and Deb Sy and a number of other people who were doing interaction analysis work of negotiation and mediation process. Al Sillers, who was doing a lot of interaction analysis of marital conflict. And I was doing my dissertation, which ended up being a like sequential analysis of 36 complete real-time divorce child custody mediation sessions, data that was very generously supplied by Jessica Pearson and Nancy Fens from their court annexed work that had just started. And so we were doing deep dives, right? Looking at mediator, disputant interaction patterns, integrative, distributive, that linked to outcomes of mediation. As I was doing this work, it wasn't happening in a vacuum, right? And, to me, context is catalyst, very much so. So this was happening at the time where, there was this nascent ADR field that was blowing up all around us, Pound Conference in 77, court annexed programs really being put into place in the early and mid 80s, community mediation centers. And pushed by this sense of need for responsive legal institutions. So, my micro analysis, penchant was also kind of, having this backdrop of, wow, what's happening in this larger picture, and how does this work make sense here? I also, at that time, was doing some work in analyzing the efficacy of these mediation and ADR systems that we were putting into place. And the bottom line here is that it became pretty clear that there was something missing. I, by the way, was not the only person who felt this, right? This by now was like mid-1990s. And a number of us, like Sidney Noble and, Alan Tidwell at USIP, et cetera, we were all kind of having the same conversations, which was, there is something missing. And if you look across the spectrum of the interventions that we have, what we do not have is a one-on-one intervention that allows for deep conflict analysis by the party and for the party before they go into other systems and interventions. So literally, I was pulled into what would that look like? What could it do? And how could it fit contexts? And so my colleagues and I started working with, looking at other thinking and talking with the other thinkers that were putting together processes. And what we did was basically say, for us, that one-on-one conflict coaching process is most important in terms of providing deep conflict analysis for strategic action and empowerment. And the process that we developed, we wanted to bring in and honor the most powerful theories that we were seeing. And of course, the hallmark of that for us was narrative theory, right? The general area of narrative theory, but also the great work that Winslade and Monk were doing, Cobb and Rifkin were doing. But one of the things about the great narrative theory work that was happening in our conflict field at the time was that the emphasis was on the co-construction of narrative between the third party and the party. What was missing was the party's ability to co-construct and create narrative with themselves, right? And the power of narrative is truly that, right? They are the most important audience for what's happening in that conflict analysis. We also wanted to bring into this process the theory work that we knew about identity, emotion, and power as critical drivers, and a big emphasis on the emotion work, right? So much at that time was really kind of the blending of what we were coming to understand about emotion and conflict that were not necessarily represented to the extent that they might be in other processes like mediation, etc. Visioning, looking forward and creating future narratives for action, and then skill development. So our conflict coaching model is really, those of you who might be familiar with it, it's really built on those fundamental theoretical pillars. And then we wanted to say, okay, how does the systems context that conflict coaching would be used in affect the application and the fit? So today, I want to talk with you about work we've been doing in conflict coaching really over the last 20, 25 years. And I'm only going to mention 3 contexts and keep it really brief. And if people are interested, we can talk about it later, right? Workplace was the biggest draw at the time in the mid-1990s, largely because the federal sector had passed ADRA, the Alternative Dispute Resolution Act in 1996. And federal agencies were mandated to have internal ADR systems, and they were hungry for innovation and exploration and things that were fitting the need. And they had the same need of people not using mediation processes as they had hoped. So we started working with the VA to build their conflict coaching arm of the ADR program. Since then, conflict coaching has been accepted as a third-party process under the Management Directive 110 for AEO and EEO compliance disputes. And it's included in most, maybe all at this point, federal agencies. And we work with and have worked with about 14 federal agencies over the last 20, 25 years to implement this work. We also have worked with international organizations, most specifically the United Nations. So we started working with the UN UNOMS program, their Ombuds and Mediation Services program, across all of their 13 global regions about 4 or 5 years ago. And now our model is the formal model that the United States Secretariat uses. They use it in all of their global regions, and they are finding that it fits particularly in intercultural conflict situations that they see in the workplace. And we are working with the World Bank, not to stand up a cohort of conflict coaches, but to look at issues of infusion of conflict coaching skills and practices into mediation. All right. And of course, lots of private sector conflict coaching happening in a number of places. The second context I want to mention briefly is community mediation. Community mediation is such a powerful engine in so many ways. So we wanted to see whether we could partner with 2 or 3 states that had the most advanced community mediation systems. And New York and Maryland definitely came up with the New York Unified Court Systems OCA program, the New York Dispute Resolution Association, and in Maryland, MACRO, right? And so for the last, 12 years now, we have worked with all of the community mediation centers that cover the 62 counties of New York State, building conflict coaching systems. And they use it in all areas of service: criminal court, family, youth-based, community, etc. That has been such an amazing gift to work with these gifted practitioners and theorists and scholars in how they have taken this and made it fit systems across their state. Very similar experience with Maryland under MACRO. And then most recently, and frankly very close to my heart, is the application in special education dispute resolution. Partly because I am a parent of a child who needed special education services, and I was on the other side of what I often think about as a very bad dispute resolution system in most schools and educational agencies. Bottom line is that we have just started in the last 3 years. We were invited by the state of California to come in and work with their special education local planning agencies. They have 137 of them in the state of California. they are charged with providing all special education servicing with districts and family empowerment centers, and basically providing the dispute resolution services. And they really wanted to infuse conflict coaching because what they knew from what they were seeing was that parties, especially parents and family members, were not able and ready to engage in IEPs or mediations. They needed the conflict analysis support. They needed the time to have somebody help them thinking through what was going on with them for their family and their child. And I'm very pleased to say that because of that California work, we have just started with CADRE, the Consortium for Appropriate Dispute Resolution in Special Education, which is the Office of Special Education Research's Technical Assistance National Program, a pilot project where we are working with 5 states now over the next 2 years to infuse conflict coaching in their special ed ADR systems. So a lot of fascinating.
Can I quickly ask about research? Because you did not talk about research, you just talked about application outside of the research community.
Yeah.
And I'm really concerned about what is going on. So last week I was thrown out of the PSYOP meeting and arrested in Denver because PSYOP cannot deal with research misconduct. My ex-wife stole some of my papers and also put my daughter in psychiatry. And so I'm really wondering why the whole ethics part in PSYOP and also in IOM also banned me from the mailing list for reporting misconduct. So I really wonder why we have competent people like you in AOM and maybe also PSYOP and nothing's happening.
Yeah. And Jonas, I'm sorry to hear that you had that experience. That is a terrible experience. And I will let the AOM folks, speak to some of the other issues that you brought up. Very briefly, I will say that we have been and are doing research within the Maryland and New York community mediation centers. We are doing it in some of the agencies that we work with, although that is proprietary information. They do regular research in terms of the efficacy and impact that they see from conflict coaching, but that's not necessarily something that they want to release out of house, right? And when and how they do that is largely their decision, although we consult with them on that. But I think one of the things that is a takeaway from your comment is we need more. There's no doubt. Over the last 25 years, this intervention has really grown immensely and has a lot of utility, but the research has not kept up with it. And in fact, that's one of the things that I'm excited about having people like CADRE as partners or the California SELPAs, because they are committed to researching efficacy of these programs. But we definitely need, as we have always needed, more research on mediation processes in the field and arbitration and conciliation. We definitely need more research on exactly how this process is working optimally, definitely.
So related questions, maybe also how you see it when it does not work. I mean, I think the problem in research that we see now is that there's ultimately nothing happening when people like steal papers or lie in papers and stuff like that. So the editor do nothing. The AOM also, I discussed with AOM ethics committee. They also always say, yeah, we do a mediation, or you can talk to the person who did it, but we are not really responsible, or we don't do anything. So I wonder how you see that when there's like no formal or informal justice in a research system. So
yeah, again, that's a huge question, Jonas. What I will say, and I can't wait to have Ellen and Randall also kind of speak to this, but what I will say is that I am more interested in when this does not work than when it does, because we have a fair amount of knowledge and evidence about why it works and when it works and who it works for. But for example, in the special education context that I just mentioned, it is imperative that we not become salespeople trying to push an ADR process into a system where it does not deliver what needs to be delivered for parents and family members and the children that they are trying to protect and serve. So we have to be very, very focused on being as honest, brutally honest about when and what doesn't work with these processes. So I applaud you for bringing up that point. And I think it's a larger conversation across our entire field. about how to do that. I know for me in the conflict coaching arena, that is extremely important,
Yeah,
particularly
thank
when
you
we're
both.
serving underserved communities. Sorry about that, Michael.
Oh, no, you're good. I interrupted you. Thank you both for that. That sounds like it could be its own webinar, but I wanted to kind of get back to your journey, Tricia. So you had this sort of collective group of people that were thinking about your first slide here with the narrative theory and all that. So how does that go from, how did this get traction? Was it just the ADR call in the early 90s that you talked about, and you got your group or whoever you were thinking with went for that, and then you went on, and then there were other opportunities that just came your way or that you got exposed to as you were going? Because I want to kind of show or hear about how you moved from your idea through this progression, because you make it sound super smooth. So
yeah.
I thought, well,
And
did
this
you
has
have
been
any?
an almost 30-year journey, though.
Yeah, did you have any roadblocks, and how did you get over them?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, one of the things that I did was I thought, I'm going to first take this idea. Well, my colleague Ross and I, wrote a book about the model itself and the theoretical bases so that people could kind of understand the depth of that. But in reaching out to say, can we try this out seriously in different, that's one of the reasons I picked starting with the VA and as of the first federal agency, because ADRA made a huge difference. It took a lot of the obstacles away. I kind of on the catalyst thing, definitely leverage fertile fields, right? I mean, if you have no system there to support you in trying to put this work into effect in any way, then, you're probably not going to be able to do it as an innovative mechanism. Same with the community mediation areas, right? Going to New York and talking with New York, because they had the strongest, biggest, longest, best community mediation infrastructure in the country. They still do, right? And so it was like, if you think this idea has merit, let's talk about how. How would you use it? Who would you want to have as coaches? How would we build up those parts of the system? How would we look at the efficacy, right? So, that was huge, and that took a lot of challenges out of the way. Ironically, I would say that some of the biggest challenges that were out there is trying to help people understand that conflict coaching is an ADR process. It is not counseling. It is not therapy, right? And that's really been an ongoing conversation that we've had over the years to try to help distinguish between why this is an ADR frame and belongs in an ADR, an integrated conflict management system. The other, which I will say that my colleagues and I across the conflict coaching work, I think we've done a pretty darn good job of, is we didn't want to fall into the trap of there's only one best model. Because honestly, at the time, we were living through a lot of that conflict with the whose mediation orientation are you attached to dispute that was going on for about a decade and a half in the area of mediation practice. And I remember us meeting at conferences and sitting down as groups of people and just basically saying, how is this going to grow best and smartest? And we all said to each other, we are not in the business of saying why mine is better than yours. We are going to be collaborative from the get-go. And to this day, even though there are differences in the models and approaches, all of us, I think, can honestly say we would endorse any of the large-scale models that are out there in conflict coaching, and we always have. And I mean, we were learning from being in the middle of the kind of transformative, facilitative mediation battles that had been going on in that very same decade. Yeah. The last thing that I will say is we still have difficulty sometimes with, I think, people looking at this work and saying, as a scholar, what are you doing? Building systems, right? What are you doing? Why are you putting your energies there? And I think that is a conversation that is getting better and better and better, but one that still crops up in really interesting ways to me, to say, because this has a practical, very practical application, does not mean it's atheoretic. Quite the contrary. Doesn't mean it's not research. Quite the contrary, right? So the tower is not our friend. all the time. And I think that's one of the things that these kinds of webinars help us so much, to be able to bring out conversations about all of these very theoretically informed interventions and programs, and why we should all be endorsing and seeing. I mean, I'd love for a bunch of researchers to say, I'd love to be able to say to the UN, hey, here are like 17 or 18 researchers who are really interested in doing research in your 13 global regions on the efficacy of this conflict coaching process that you've endorsed throughout the organization. That's where we should be.
Because we have some people that are looking for inspiration about their own ideas of things that they would like to do, before we pass it on to Randall, can you give us one or two sort of inspirational or pieces of advice for us that are sitting here like, we have a really good idea. Boy, I can't believe that Tricia did all this. This is just amazing. How do I do something like that with my own idea?
I would say that, and I'm a very stubborn person. Everyone who knows me would go, whoa, she is a stubborn person, right? First and foremost, meet their need. So like in special education, which is so deep to my heart, I'm interested in meeting the need of the systems that serve those families and those schools. And if that is kind of the way you go into it, and you're willing and open to having your idea massaged through this kind of collaborative fit with the systems you may not fully understand, then that's step one, right? That it goes hand in hand with learn their systems. Don't assume you know what they're living in, and give them that nod. The other is, finding and nurturing champions of innovation. The one example I will give, was as we were doing the work in New York, one of the people who was at the New York Peace Institute was working very closely with the Assistant District Attorney of the Kings County, Brooklyn, Mike Bryan. And they had this idea of, hey, conflict coaching can be great for criminal court cases. And I said, I don't think so, you guys. I think that this is an overreach, significantly an overreach. Well, a year and a half later, they had worked through and designed an approach to conflict coaching that they ended up using in Kings County criminal cases at, generally, obviously, lower levels. And Mike Ryan, as the assistant DA, he was the one who kept saying to us, look, I can see why it will work. Right. And I know why it will work. And let's try it on. Let's see what happens with that.
So how does it work? I'm interested because I have a US court case now because I wanted to enter a scientific conference, which is also quite unusual. So how does that conflict coaching work? And do they do it in Denver?
Yeah, well, when somebody comes in with a certain level of dispute or charge, I'm sorry, and again, they agree to plead guilty to that charge and go through a conflict coaching session. So it's kind of a voluntold session. But they are, mandated by the court to go to that and go through the conflict coaching. But they don't have to actually go through a process. All they have to do is show up for it. And then they decide whether they want to go through the process. And what they found, I think, across, they usually have about 14,000 cases or so a year that come through that court. What they found was that the people were coming into conflict coaching, and once they understood it could be about whatever they needed to talk about in terms of the conflict, and that it was confidential, and that they could do, wasn't going to get back to the court. They had checked the box. They had showed up. Then a significant percentage of those people wanted to use it, stayed, used it, sometimes came back for multiple sessions. So again, what the court was finding was that it was filling a need for the people who were caught in a justice system where they knew that they had transgressed and they were willing to try to take responsibility, but they needed something else to try to help them figure out how they were going to orient differently in future and similar situations.
Well, I have to kind of cut you off. I do want to say, Jonas, that her book with Brinkert really does a thorough, detailed job of explaining the whole conflict coaching process. And maybe you all can talk more later, or you could check out that book. It's actually a book that I reviewed for a journal once upon a time, maybe 20 years ago or longer. That's really quite excellent. Anyway, We'll come
I
back.
think the problem is when I would plead guilty, then I think we can also like stop doing research in a way, because then you cannot criticize anybody anymore, because I think
Okay,
that's what's
well,
happened.
Jonas, we are going to go ahead and move to Randall. Thank you, Tricia. We can maybe talk more later towards the end. Randall, take it away. It's all yours.
All right, so my story is going to be somewhat, I think, different from that, and the type of impact a little bit different from that. So, I started graduate school in 1990, and became very quickly interested in one of my faculty advisors, Phil Tetlock, was doing, which is trying to understand how can we learn about things like group dynamics and the impact of that in not most of the data comes from the lab, or you observe teams in some way, etc. But there actually documented evidence on teams that have existed historically. And does that say something different, for example? And how would we do that in a way that is kind of systematic? um so we were looking at things like groupthink theory, and he was particularly interested in political, top political groups, that kind of thing. Um and so the problem was we didn't was methodological. And one of the things I guess I learned over time is that sometimes the most interesting problems are unstudied because we just don't have the methods to deal with it. And so I've taken that to heart and really focused on that in a lot of what I do. Um, and by my second year of graduate school, I started thinking about, well, business groups, and thinking about what's the impact of leaders within the team. So at the time, there was a huge academic debate about how much do leaders really matter. There were those who saying, not really, it's really about the structures and the systems they were in. And others saying, well, of course, leadership matters kind of massively in an organization or in a team or whatever. And I really felt like I needed to understand. I thought, well, of course, leadership matters. But the question was how, and how to show that. So I came up with the idea that I was going to look at not only those historical groups that we were looking at, but start looking at the personality of the CEOs or leaders we were looking at, and wrote this paper that got rejected at all the top journals pretty much, in part because it was just so different from anything out there. One of the things I guess I've learned along the way is that if you have an idea that's a little bit different, that's fresh, you think, it's going to piss certain people off, right? And they're just, and they will find
That's
ways.
also what I had. I got also rejected almost everywhere, and even at preprint servers, nobody wants to talk about it. And I certainly agree with you that CEOs matter, especially PsyOps CEO, who kind of terminated my PsyOps membership and revoked my fellowship only because I talked about misconduct.
Yeah. And of course, they create culture, which is ultimately what matters. And it starts with the top team, the people around them, and how a CEO interacts affects the culture of that team, which then affects the organization. Which is essentially what I mean. In retrospect, I was interested in CEO personality and kind of goes on in the organization. And what I really discovered was that understanding group dynamics, particularly of those kind of senior teams, is actually a really great way of understanding what organizations do and why they do it. So and I started getting interested in boards and top management teams. That's about the time I made the move from psychology into a business school. And really then started focusing on that initial paper, which should eventually get published. Turns out I now know, I had no idea at the time, was the first paper to look at Big Five personality and CEO personality. and using the group dynamics as a metaphor for understanding how that impact works was really novel. And it was novel not just for me in OB, but in strategy became a big thing. So I've got a whole kind of following in the strategy field that I totally found by accident. And they get invited to all these things. They're interested in it. And there's now been, at least 50 papers looking at Big Five personality and the impact in organizations. And a lot of it is really focused on, for example, some of the smaller organizations, not just the big, the big ones, and have regularly interacted then with people who are interested in understanding that dynamic. And as I said, it also got me interested in things like boards and board dynamics. And so I've done work most recently in the board space, which was something I was interested in for a very long time, but using the kind of group dynamic metaphor for understanding how people manage conflict, etc., in a boardroom. And I wrote a book called Disaster in the Boardroom, which is explaining all the like crazy things that happen in boards, where we document 300 years of it. We show that it's global, and we show that how those boards manage conflict and the dynamics that they create is really central to understanding whether they make a decent decision or not, when particularly whether they make really crazy decisions. And the book has had more impact in a way that I didn't quite expect, which I had hoped for, of course, but you can't expect it. Where let's see, I'm not public. I have been asked, and they call it a fresh perspective on understanding boards. And this is all their language. And all the big consultancies globally have like CEO and chair networks of people who are doing board work, and I've presented for for all the big consultancies for sure. That has to do depends. This is where you have to get into what the structure is. In the corporate, of course, the board is the ultimate decider on that. But in a place like PSYOP, it's the membership, so you have to work through that.
Randall,
Um,
can I reframe that question to more of, so you've definitely had this broad reach with your ideas and what you've learned about these boards. And so how do you see all this interest that you've had have an impact broadly across the different places that you've spoken with, the different consultancy groups and all this stuff? What sort of change do you see occurring from bringing your ideas out to all these people and your books and all this stuff? Because it looks like there's a huge reach. What is their takeaway?
their takeaway has to do, oftentimes just with the basic kind of what we think of as basic group dynamics, conflict stuff, task conflict, relationship conflict, the kind of stuff I've published a lot around. Understanding that degree of task conflict is helpful, but you can go too far. You need some, but not too much. The paper that never got the traction I wanted it to was the one that shows that relationship conflict is a symptom of other problems in that group rather than the cause of. The correlation is always really high because it's actually reverse causality. They find that fascinating and helpful, to not over focus on whether people like each other or not, to focus much more on managing kind of the conflict ideas. And
So there's less blame. There's
yeah,
less
so
blaming that goes on.
I always warn against what I call the blame game.
Yeah.
People love to hold individual other people to account. We do this in management generally, but it's particularly strong there. If I told you or asked you to do something, you go off and do it badly. I want to blame you for not listening. You're going to blame me for poor instruction. None of that solves the problem, right? problem is we had a communication breakdown here somewhere, and we need to solve that. But again, execs find this really helpful. I mean, say in the last month, I've taught about this in the US, the UK, Japan, Cyprus, Singapore, right? And we get into good discussions about it. That is for them, it is a very different way of thinking about how a board should work. And what the priorities are and how it happened and what to focus on to resolve it. So, I've started really focusing also on publishing in places like Harvard Business Review, which early in career I just poo-pooed as kind of like lesser scholarship. I totally don't think that anymore. It's one of the ways you have impact in out there in the world, certainly in the world of management, because that has incredible reach and people do actually read it. And so the stuff I've been working on in the last few years really about structure of conflict, that task conflict that's dyadic is super helpful. Task conflict that's, this faction against that one is hopeless, and what to do about it, right? Versus, if everybody has involved in the conflict, you always need neutral outsiders in a group setting for the group outcome to be positive. Is what it shows. And I think that it very much ties back to a lot of what, Tricia and others will talk about, and where we're in the middle now, it's like, what specifically are they doing? Are they mediating? Or is it even in some ways just the sheer presence that really matters here? And I think we think they're actually doing some mediation. I think the thing that has surprised us is that people who have ideas, and they're trying to get them accepted, can also mediate at the same time.
Mhm. How did you get your ideas to have traction? And also, well, let's just start with that. How did you get momentum and traction for where you are today from when you talked about earlier your first initial ideas? How did it grow?
Yeah, so I realize now I've always followed this pattern of I do some basic research and get it published, and then I start teaching about it. Because the teaching tells me how to talk about it in a way that a practitioner can actually access it. Once I've kind of figured out the angle on it that is most easily understandable, then I try to publish it in a practitioner outlet, right? And then once I've got it in the practitioner outlet, right, then other people can pick it up. So I'll have, other faculty, et cetera, can use it and actually teach it. And it has a much then broader impact once I've done that. But I can't go, in my experience, I've not been able to go easily from academic research to practitioner publication without the interim step of teaching it enough to know what angle on it is interesting to others.
What resonates with people?
Yeah. And sometimes I can predict it, and sometimes I'm constantly amazed like what sticks and what doesn't with others, in some of what I do. So it's a conscious strategy of trying to push it through what I call, I think it was full cycle from basic research through a process that allows others to kind of really access what I'm doing along the way. And I said the teaching, practitioner outlet, book, when I've got enough. So and I've got the next couple of books lined up for that reason. Book gives incredible in my experience here has been the book is I wasn't convinced by books for a while. It's really early in career, and so most of our academic institutions don't particularly value them that much. But practitioner-oriented books really allow your ideas to have much greater impact than you could have possibly been able to do, like on your own teaching or whatever. because practitioners read books. They might read, if they're managers, they might read a bit of HBR, but they really do read books.
Did you have any obstacles along the way in getting your ideas out there, or the process
I
that
think
you described?
I think there's two big obstacles for me. The one I've already mentioned, which is when you have an idea that isn't kind of currently the way of thinking in the profession,
Mhm.
there's a lot of pushback, and you have to really believe in your ideas. And if you don't, right, it's easy to just think, okay, withdraw and not get them out there. And that you're not going to have the kind of when you're getting that kind of pushback. I now realize is because you're on to something interesting,
Mhm.
right?
And what type of
And
pushback do you mean? What type of pushback do you mean? Rejections or?
oh, I'm talking about when you get reviews back, and the reviews are not just,
Mhm.
well, the reviews are, this is the worst piece of research I've read in the last decade.
Where we're trusting the review process, or we're seeking other feedback. What do you do as Randall Peterson? How do we then kind of get past that so we're not quitting and we continue on with our belief of ideas? How do you do that? How do you process that and then move forward with your ideas? You don't quit.
Yeah, so in this case, for example, I was trying to talk to leadership scholars who were kind of like not interested in personality, etc. And it was the realization that I needed to talk to personality people
Mhm.
and hope that the leadership people would see it. And of course, as soon as it's published, like they see it. So I got to my audience by talking to a different audience or
Okay.
framing it in a way that the other audience is open to hearing it. So what audience am I aiming for? And each of the big journals has a different audience, in a
Uh-huh.
different frame. So it's reframing it in a way that one of those big audiences, they will welcome it much more than others. And even and I got that a bit wrong. I thought that again, it's related, and I think, to this idea of having to teach it in order to really get the message right. I had to go through that process of
Mhm.
rejection in order to figure out the message, the pass through that was appealing to the right audience for those ideas to get some air.
It's sort of similar to what Tricia talked about when these different groups wanted to use conflict coaching, and she initially thought, well, maybe that doesn't really fit. But allowing these other groups to sort of massage your idea, I think that's what Tricia said, massage
Yeah,
your idea. And so now you just say, well, I intended it for this audience,
yeah.
not going over very well. But instead of quitting, you say, well, maybe I need to reframe it differently, try a different audience. Then once you said it was in print, then everyone could see it. So it's about the right ground to plant your ideas in and to let them grow.
Absolutely, I 100% agree with that, and not always knowing upfront which is the right framing or the right
Right.
audience, right? But if it's a great idea, it will connect somewhere. Once it starts to connect, as we always say you should say in the sales, land and expand. But you got to land first, and figuring out how to land is the most tricky, I think, part of the process. Once you land, it's kind of established in a way, and you can then expand and find the different, because like that big strategy audience who's interested in my work, that wasn't my initial target at all,
Yes.
right? But they saw something in it once it landed somewhere, and they take it and they've made it their own in a way that I find incredible. More power to it. I'm really happy about it.
So that's where the
Uh,
traction comes from.
yeah,
Your place to land. You find out, oh, here's another audience that really loves this idea or sees what I'm talking about. And then it grows from there. That's the traction. Would you say
yeah.
that's accurate?
That certainly resonates with my experience completely.
What go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask you then, for those of us that have ideas and that we're here to hear these experiences, what one or two pieces of advice would you give us? Because we've already learned several great things from both Tricia and yourself about how to get past hurdles, how to get traction, how to sort of where to take our idea after we get sort of an initial idea, a micro idea, to move it forward. So what pieces of advice, one or two, that you could give us?
So one of them is one that was given to me when I was a graduate student, and I totally poo-pooed it and thought it was irrelevant, and I was totally wrong, which is this is a persistence game much more than you appreciate when you walk in, right? Just because you've been rejected once or twice or even 3 times does not mean that the idea isn't great. Okay. And, and at what point, there's always the question, at what point do you give up? Right. But don't give up too soon, because my best ideas, the ones that ultimately have the most impact academically and out there in the world, have been ones that were initially rejected. So that would be my most important bits of advice. The other bit of advice would be, again, I've talked about it, but sometimes the most interesting questions just need some thought about methodologically, how can I achieve that? And not to be scared of that. Early in career, I thought, but actually, when you're the first in, right? And, people will work, but how do I get in?
Thank you so much. Ellen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Michael. I was really intrigued by the stories before me. So I think I'm going to speak about something that maybe sounds very simple. I'm just, okay. Very simple, because you already mentioned that I've been involved in hostage negotiations. So I'm not going to talk about that negotiations, but about a slightly related topic, but that really is something that's close to the heart. And well, one of the things that I've learned is that sometimes the very basic questions, very simple questions that you ask, and people say, oh gosh, why hasn't that ever been researched, right? So, and my question was as follows. It was about 30 years ago, and I was pursuing a PhD in business negotiations, and then I got sort of coincidentally involved in the new training for police negotiators. And then quite quickly after that, so I attended the training and then gave advice about how they could restructure that. And then quite quickly, and also after getting involved in authentic cases, I realized that a huge difference with most of the other negotiations that I looked at was that it was not about a company or a car or a house or any other commodity, but it was about human life. And that for me as a psychologist changed everything. And I said, okay, guys, what I see now in those cases is that you have a lot of interactions with those hostages, that they are present at the negotiations, but do you have any clue what they experience in this situation? And if you talk to them, for example, what you could say to them. And they said, well, it was a bit quiet. And everybody said no. And then I started studying the literature, and I really couldn't find any literature about it. So when psychologists are involved in those kind of hostage situations, they look at how people get out of it. They look at how people recover, if they develop PTSD, what treatment is working. But I couldn't find anything about people being in such a situation and what they experience and what could be helpful for them, what negotiators can do or not. So I thought I'm going to study that myself with a couple of colleagues. So we started interviewing former hostages, informed by the tapes. We had recordings of those negotiations, so we started to talk to them, go back to the negotiations. And actually that led to already back in 2005 to a paper. And I really had difficulty. So Randall, I I feel for you. We really had a difficulty publishing that, so it ended up in some sort of practical report. But it was published, and there were a couple of important lessons that we got out of that research. So we did semi-structured interviews, and so for one, I'll just mention two. But people who are interested, of course, can read it. But one, we found these huge differences between people who were in a siege situation versus a kidnapping situation. So the psychological experience is very, very different. And it also means that what negotiators can do actually to make them feel better in those situations is very different. So in a siege situation, for example, people really feel at the center of the world, right? There's a lot of activity. There's police, everything. And in a kidnapping situation, people feel like they're isolated, they're lost, they're alone at the world. They have no contact at all. So what you see in a siege situation, that they are mostly concerned about police intervention, for example. While in a hostage or in a kidnapping situation, they have a lot of uncertainty. So do people know that I'm away, that I've been taken hostage? Is there anything going on? Are there negotiations going on? So what we see in those kind of situations is that, for example, proof of life is psychologically, a proof of life question that you often ask is psychologically very important for people in a situation like that. And police really didn't tend to look at it that way. So they tended to look tactically, but not how can we reinforce, for example, the hostages' morale or their identity or anything. So that was one outcome from the research. The other was that I think actually, but I really realized only later on that we debunked sort of the Stockholm syndrome. And I'm not sure if you're all familiar with that, but it's the idea, I think it's all around the world that people think that hostages quite quickly have a bond with the hostage taker and then do all kinds of irrational things and work opposite to the police. And actually what we found is that that's not the case at all, that's happening. And that second part, that's actually the thing that has been picked up a lot. And what so when I look, what really mattered was that publication. I traveled around Europe. I went to the police, so the talking and the teaching and what resonates. So what Randall said, I recognize that. And then I think the first change when it grew bigger was that the Dutch police said, okay, we realize this is important and we want to include it in the basic hostage negotiation training. So I have been teaching about this for years now. Every year I talk about the hostage experience, and I more or less reflect on what they experience and what hostage negotiators can learn from that. And the second change was that in 2013 it was published in a United Nations brief on terrorist hostage taking. And they actually said, okay, this research shows that it's not only about that hostages come out alive of a hostage situation, but also that you are responsible for their psychological well-being. So by acknowledging that, I think a lot of things changed. And I think the third thing is that while with the actual Stockholm incident being a certain amount of time away, like Netflix movies like Clark, there has been this new interest in this whole Stockholm syndrome. So I've been talking a lot about it in the media, both from the Netherlands and across Europe, and really could spread the message. Be careful to stigmatize people who are in a situation like that. If they sort of have positive feelings, they usually have. Most hostages report positive and negative feelings, and actually that's quite normal. That's not a syndrome. It's actually a normal or a consequence of normal social interactions. So maybe those are the three things that I feel. Something that started like really small grew in something bigger, also being included in all kinds of documents like handbooks for management of these types of situations. Yeah.
It sounds like, as I listen to all three of our panelists, it is this sort of process of you first have your academic audience, or you try to find your academic audience. You get feedback from them, so that influences your ideas. And then somehow, through your persistence,
Yes.
you step out of that academic audience to a more applied or practical audience. You don't know who they are necessarily when you started off, but then they find your idea, you find them, you get their feedback on it, and you're continuously willing to receive that feedback and to let your idea evolve so that it can have that wider range of people that see the value in it, and it becomes macro. But you have to be persistent, and you have to be willing to take that feedback and make changes. But you still have your core idea that you started off with, but you learn to envision it in ways you never did probably at the very, very beginning. Maybe tell me if that's wrong. And then it really takes off a life of its own, and you see the great value it has for society. Would you agree with that assessment here so far, Ellen?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think that's so the persistence and trying to keep your curiosity, but also listen to what others say and transform your idea and the focus you lie and the things you highlight, and also look at other fields. I also like that part. So I now, for example, in contact with colleagues who work in the field of sexual abuse, and they say, also here we see that people have that ambiguity towards a perpetrator. Actually, that's also normal in this field. It's
so Ellen, you were talking before about how there were other fields that were looking for, that could see the application and what you've already done and already have worked. So how did you respond to that? I mean, I'm assuming that more and more people are saying, hey, this could apply to what I'm doing or where I'm working.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's the practical part. What I now see, it's interesting that other academics that are working in related fields, on cults, for example, or on sexual abuse cases, or and they see parallels with the work I've been doing. So we're actually teaming up right now and seeing how we can combine our joint insights, backgrounds, create new projects. And that's extremely valuable. I think it's also difficult because you're going to work with people from a different field,
right?
Right. So it's also sometimes can complicate things, but I really well, it's something that I really appreciate doing. But I've always done it, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I think it's like you're having to also learn a little bit of another language, and you're sort of sharing and co-constructing the application of your ideas to, well, another language, another worldview, another way of doing things. And that's just part of the being flexible with yourself and your own ideas, and seeing the value or learning the value it is to another group of people. But there is that period of time, I think, that could be an obstacle where you're trying to get on the same page and mesh your ideas together and then find that path for that other field to work. And then it's a beautiful thing, but there probably is that little messy period of time when you're trying to speak the same language. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It's not always a little bit of time. Sometimes it's a bumpy road sometimes, yeah. But yeah, as long as you keep each other in place, you respect each other's background, and you keep communicating, there can be something really beautiful grow out of it. But sometimes it doesn't work. I've also experienced that.
Right.
So that you realize, okay, right, we're not getting any further with this project. So some things work out and others don't. I think the thing is you have to know when you have to quit or not, or when you have to be persistent. So, and that's, I don't know. It's also informed by other people. Yeah.
Well, for those of us that want to do something great, like all of you have been doing, how do you wrestle with those questions to know, like, well, I need to be persistent. I think there's something here, or it's not. You kind of said that you don't know, but what would you guess for you personally, when you're invested in your idea, it's yours initially, when does it feel like I can be persistent here? Or maybe not?
Oh, that's a tough question. That's really a tough question. I really believed in this project, but I really believed in this project. And I think what changed is that at a certain point, I felt I had to present it in a different way. So what I did was that what I originally used as research material, so I recorded all of those interviews. And I thought maybe I can also use those interviews to give the hostages themselves a platform to tell their own stories, right? I think Tricia talked about narratives, how important they are. So I've actually built sort of or compiled sort of a class where I had different types of hostages tell their personal stories. And they were illustrations of the thing that I wanted to get across. And the power of people talking and using that material, of course, with consent of the people who were interviewed, for this specific target audience, that was especially strong. And also for the hostages themselves, because they felt that one way or the other, that what they had experienced now had some sort of meaning, right? Something good came out of it. But they were also heard. So I think the use of that material, that changed a lot. But your question was, of course, how do you know? Well, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes you don't. Maybe one of the other panelists, or Randall, do you have an idea when you know or don't know?
I mean, for me, I always had at least a few people around me who kind of also could see the value in it. So that if it was just me, I probably would have given up. Right. And it's my idea and I'm promoting it. But there were always a few people around who said, yes, this really does have merit, right? And encouraged me. That made all the difference.
Yeah. I can see. That sounds good. I'll take that advice for the next time I'm in doubt.
Tricia, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and first of all, Ellen, I just want to say, and Randall, I so appreciate listening to what you're sharing, and I'm, thinking to myself, who has the right to have a story, who is not allowed to tell it? And for me, and I'm really quite moved by what you've just shared, Ellen, because I think that for me is the most of the time the answer to the question of when I will choose to be persistent, right? So it comes down to sometimes the system just assumes certain people don't need or want or have the right to have their own narrative or have that narrative respected. And there's a great deal of harm in so many ways that happens because of that. And yeah, that's when I'll push. When the answer I sometimes get is, this is serving the system, but it's not serving the people the system's supposed to serve, then I will back off. That's the point at which I'm like, I don't want to be co-opted, in the system or by the system. That might sound pretty simplistic, but yeah. And I just want to say, would love to see and learn a lot more about the materials that you're using in terms of the narratives of the survivors of hostage situation. Because I personally think there's a direct corollary to narratives of adults and parents who have been eaten up by the special education system. That might not
Yes.
seem like a real connect for you all, but I think for people who live through that system and lose in that system, there is a great deal that would really help. Thank you so much.
It sounds like that's kind of like a thread for all of our panelists today. And that the obstacles you're running into is because you're presenting a new narrative of something that you see as a challenge that people in these other organizations don't really see or want to see, whatever the reason is. That could be a whole other conversation. But you're willing to stay the course and say, you help to identify, you're presenting an initial idea that challenges the narrative, and then you're testing it out in other groups that say, hey, you know what? This is something I'm looking for. This is a different narrative to a problem that I'm dealing with. And this is an opportunity to take this other person's ideas, your ideas, and apply them to our setting, because they want to change the narrative too, or they resonate the obstacle that you have experienced, that they've also experienced, perhaps in a different context. And you're willing to go all the way. And how you choose to spend your time is, I guess, your intuition of what is valuable to creating change. That's my assessment just from listening to you. I don't know if that's off the mark or not.
Well, that totally works for me. that totally, yeah. Thank you. I think you got it there, Michael.
Yeah.
Well, you all gave it to me. For your own narratives.
Yeah, but it's a great summary of, I wouldn't have been able to phrase it that way until you summarized so nicely.
Oh,
And it
thanks.
really does work.
So, Ellen, you haven't given us your 1 or 2 pieces of advice for those of us that want to do something great with our ideas, that you would advise us to consider and moving on our journeys.
Yes. Well, yeah. I think every approach is unique, so it's always a bit tricky to give your own, right? Everybody has his own way of doing stuff, and I know now what my way is. So what I already said, this genuine interest, also this true curiosity and trying to find those simple questions. But I think because I work intensely with the police. So nowadays, the police is way more open, at least in the Netherlands, to research than they were 20 years ago. So we have ongoing relationships with them. I do a lot of research projects, PhDs. But still, I find it really important to have those good relationships, but on the other hand, also keep my own role as a researcher. So make sure that I am an independent. So always reassuring I'm independent, I can be critical, I can actually say what I want. We can make arrangements that you might read something beforehand, but I think keeping these professional standards as a researcher, because I've also worked a lot in political tricky environments, politically loaded environments, for example. Well, I don't know if you're in the Netherlands was a big thing, the MH17 crash in Ukraine, airplane where a lot of people from the Netherlands died in that crash, and of course Russia was involved. And we did a project in which we evaluated the governmental functioning. And well, there were a lot of political forces in that research, and then you have to really think about how also for the audience, so not only for yourself, but that you very explicitly demonstrate that you are an independent researcher, you form your own opinions, and it's not being influenced by the parliament or whatever, who wishes certain outcomes of your research. So I teach
your narrative. Sorry.
Yeah, I teach students about all the dilemmas that I've experienced in these kind of situations, because you encounter things that you cannot think of when you start off with a project like that. And you have to deal then at the moment, well, with what happens. So I've experienced that in a small way with this project, but in the other projects, the MH17 and a big project I led about social safety in the military in the Netherlands, you had all those political forces trying to influence your research. And I find that intriguing, difficult, but also fun, to be honest. Yeah. So, yeah, that's maybe, yeah, I don't know if that's an advice, but I think that the independence, think about your professional standards, even while you try to connect to the field and you try to establish like long-term partnering relationships, because only then you really get at the core questions, the core key issues, I guess, that need to be resolved.
That sounds, the relationship piece that you've mentioned explicitly sounds like the second piece besides the narrative piece as being really important for not only gaining traction and overcoming obstacles, but really at flourishing. I think sometimes we forget the relationship piece because that continues, that helps it continue to grow your idea and have application to all kinds of different settings. Would you agree or no? Or
yeah, I think at this point I never do those one-off kind of things because I feel it doesn't work. So what we do is more long-term investment. So not only like, okay, you give us an assignment, we research it, for example, or we do research, here are the findings, there you have them, I present them, bye-bye. But no, really go through all the stages with practice to make sure that you get most out of it both ways, and can do follow-up stuff in the future.
would any of the panelists like to ask each other questions? Or pose a question that we can all talk about?
I guess I have a question in general, which is, how do we help support graduate students at the initiation of their scholarly journal, to think about and entertain doing the kind of work that kind of boundary spanning across disciplines and across practice areas, and that kind of thing, as individuals, but also as a system. I mean, I think there are good models that are out there, and like the graduate student, doctoral student seminar that IACM puts on a yearly basis. I think those kinds of things are wonderful. But I guess, other ideas, because I think it's tough. I think it's tougher now in some ways for new graduate students to be able to take some of the leaps that we're talking about. I don't think they have the safety nets in some ways. So.
I think it's a great question because, the standards for, getting the long-term acceptance, i.e. tenure, right, keep ramping up. And this takes time. And if you get too far on this journey too quickly, you end up failing that one. And then you don't have the platform that Ellen rightfully emphasizes, which is that independent platform is so important for your ability to be a credible influencer. And you can start going down a track and be very applied very early, and then not be able to have that. So my advice to my own students and the ones I work with has always been kind of, the career is very long. I encourage your applying ideas. Just be a little bit careful about how far you can go with it and exactly when. At least be thoughtful and reflective on and ensuring that because I've also had students who kind of want to just want to do the applied, right? It's like, but don't underestimate or underappreciate the value that Ellen talked about in that independence, right? Otherwise, you're just like any other advocate out there, and then that's not the same thing.
We have a question from KS. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your stories. It is an inspiration to see all of you bridging theory and practice. I was wondering what you thought about how this has changed over the years, just referring a little bit to what you've just talked about. bridging the gap between academics and practitioners. Are there more people bridging this gap? Are practitioners more receptive to academic work? Are academics more interested in practical work? If any of you want to take a stab at that great question, set of questions from KS.
I mean, my perspective is a bit different than in a business school. Business schools historically have, emphasized heavily, research, and then they switch over and they realize that that's not sustainable, right? And then they go much more into the practitioner. We've swung heavy in the academic direction over the last couple of decades, to the point that I think the practitioner world isn't hostile. They consider us irrelevant mostly. And as a result, I think not enough of us are doing the practical work that we're talking about here. I think that those numbers have dropped, and I feel it's a real risk for the profession. And I mean that also as a PhD psychologist. I think, there's a fine line, but I do think if we're gonna remain a high status, fashion and set of organizations, people want to send their kids to our schools, we need to do some more practical stuff than we've been doing in the last decade.
I think the situation maybe in the Netherlands a little bit different, because there has been this whole discussion in terms of profiles of great academics, of good academics, the academics that get tenure. And while we usually had like only the teaching and research pillar, we now also have a full engagement pillar. So people can actually be promoted to a full professorship on the basis of a primarily engagement. They need a minimum, of course, like to reach the bar in terms of research and teaching, but they can have a profile, and it's being acknowledged that engagement, and then engagement with society, with practice, is an important task for academics. So I think that changed a lot, that helped to change. But I also see it on the other side, like I mentioned before, that I see a lot of, at least for me, the organizations or domains I work with, the police, the military, they are really opening up also for research way more than they did like 20 years ago. So yeah, I think I'm a bit more positive from this side of the ocean. Yeah.
Well, I'm in the UK, and although there's a government, evaluation of impact research, and they're supposedly, prioritizing it, government funding goes with research excellence.
Mm-hmm. True. Yeah.
Yeah, I would also say though that I think that there is much more openness through certain funding sectors to be funding large-scale projects that clearly have designed in partnerships between practitioners and academics in the design and implementation of the projects. So, I mean, I think a lot of the Department of Justice funding, for example, the Department of Education funding in the United States is much more geared to that kind of orientation, and that helps a lot. It also helps when we can be getting very large-scale grants that can bring in younger scholars and younger academics and younger practitioners to help them have that experience of being on those project and research teams, and especially when they're interfacing with large-scale systems that they ultimately want to research and or work in, right? So whether that be an educational system or a criminal justice system, et cetera. So I think that's a bright spot that we have. And, I mean, I kind of go bright spot well now, and hopefully we'll continue to have that bright spot. But that has made a huge difference in what I see over the last decade about where these things are happening, and also the interdisciplinary nature of those teams of academic and practitioners.
Well, our time is up. I wanted to thank everybody very much for taking the time to attend and to listen to our guests, and of course, our panelist guests for sharing very profound experiences and stories. I hope that they were inspirational or gave people aim for what they might want to do with their own careers and their own lives. So thank you all for participating in the webinar. And thank you, Brandon, for putting it together for us, all the logistics and stuff.
Thank you, everybody. I
Thank
do
you,
apologize
everyone.
for some of the some of the interruptions in there, but we made our way through it.
Hey,
Thank you
we've
for your
all
time.
had
Thank you for the,
obstacles.
yeah. Oh,
Yes.
thank you for your time. Thank you for your contributions to topics and all. Yeah, very interesting. As somebody who myself straddles the academic and the practitioner world, it's interesting to hear all those perspectives. So I wish everybody the best. Have a wonderful wonderful rest of your day. Hope to see you
Thank you all.
at IACM 2025 in Burlington. Hope to see you at Academy of Management. Yeah, take care.
Take care. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
your day.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.